On behalf of the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Reimagining Citizenship, Thoughts on Relational Violence and the Construct of Whiteness. The recent Black Lives Matter protests have prompted a national reckoning focused on race and privilege. Racial violence against people of color has been a pervasive problem in the United States since the nation's beginning, and the names Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Marbury represent just three of the unknown numbers of the Black community lost to racism. This time of important and necessary change can mean a chance to shape dialogue, create change via protest and legislative action, and for folks like me, learn how to be better allies for people of color. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Courtney Ariel, tonight's presenter. Ms. Ariel is a songwriter and storyteller who is committed to speaking back and speaking truth to systems of oppression. Her writing has touched on allyship, activism, and white liberalism. She is currently a graduate student at Vanderbilt University studying theology with concentrations in religion, the arts, and gender and sexuality. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please type your questions into the live chat next to this YouTube video at any time. Carolina Celedon, my fellow Clarke Forum student project manager, will be moderating questions. We will now begin the presentation. Thank you for attending.
Thank you so much, Scout, for that introduction. Hi, my name is Courtney Arielle. I am a writer, a songwriter, a storyteller. I am a Black cisgendered woman. I'm so grateful to be here tonight. More than anything, I desire for this to be a safe space for reception. And I think the most possible avenue for that is for us to practice deep listening. Deep listening requires the suspension of judgment. And what I mean by that is we're not listening to judge our neighbor to measure up to what we think they should be. This is the only way we can be free to see who they are. It also means we are free to imagine, through empathy, a reality that might be entirely different from our own, because we're actually being let into it. Conversations about race in a nation such as ours should happen early and often. They do not. So I thank you for being here, for breathing in, being open, showing up, and honoring our collective humanity. A few definitions that will help to guide our way. Imagination, the faculty or action of forming new ideas, images, or concepts of external objects not yet present to the senses. Citizen is a legally recognized subject or national of a state or commonwealth, either native or naturalized. A citizen is also an inhabitant of a particular town or city. I'm going to read a quote by Chris Hedges, former New York Times foreign correspondent, from an article he wrote entitled, "James Baldwin and the Meaning of Whiteness." Hedges writes, "America was founded on the genocidal slaughter of indigenous people and the Holocaust of slavery. It was also founded on an imagined moral superiority and purity, which is the construct of whiteness. The fact that dominance of others came and still comes from unrestrained acts of violence is washed out of the national narrative." End quote. Next, a quote from The Myth of Redemptive Violence by Walter Wink. "The belief that violence saves is so successful because it doesn't seem to be mythic in the least. Violence simply appears to be the nature of things. It's what works. It seems inevitable, the last and often the first resort in conflicts. If a god is what you turn to when all else fails, violence certainly functions as a god. What people overlook then is the religious character of violence. It demands from its devotees an absolute obedience unto death." End quote. And this last quote is from James Baldwin himself. I'm going to paraphrase a little. "What white people have to do is try and find out in their own hearts why it is necessary to have a Negro in the first place. Because I am not a Negro, I am a man. But if you think I am, it means you need it, and the future of the country depends on this." End quote. When I speak about the construct of whiteness, I'm speaking about just that, a racial construct that many people align with and embolden and give power to, and many others do not. I remember when I was small, my father, the historian of my youth, shared with me some of the profound discrimination and bigotry endured by Irish immigrants in America. He shared about several immigrant groups that came to this country by choice, by force fleeing from famine or abject poverty, war, corruption, and beyond, or born out of a desire and courage to seek new opportunity. Each of these groups of people were othered upon their arrival here, until many of them existed here for long enough to be considered white, to lose their lineage and ties to homeland, to disappear from the signs dictating who was not welcome. I don't know if you all have seen photos of those signs or gotten to see them in museums or in real life. No Irish, no Jews, no Negroes, no Mexicans, no dogs, no Negroes. I saw that one this year at a museum in Montgomery, Alabama. No Scottish, no Polish, no Russians, no Greeks, no Italians, no Asians, no natives, no Puerto Ricans, no Hispanics, no Indians, no Negroes. And the word on the sign was never Negro. It was Nigger. If the group of people on the sign were brown, guess what? They're still on it. They're still on that metaphorical sign. But if they could be absorbed into the construct of whiteness, for the most part, that is what happened. What would have happened if all European immigrant groups maintained strong connections to their lineage and homeland? I think about that a lot. What if whiteness as a construct and capitalism as an economic system were not systems that required that someone always be on the bottom? What if having melanated skin were never considered a deficit? It is not, I assure you. But what would have happened if a construct of racial superiority were never created? What would citizenship look like then? America calls itself an immigrant nation, but very often to always demands assimilation. When I was a child, I felt fairly certain that land could not actually belong to anyone other than the indigenous inhabitants. And it made me very sad to learn about how America came to be. In my child's mind, it highlighted for me what I now know to be the gift of stewardship, which is a beautiful thing. How incredible to care for something that you love deeply for a time. What a gift also to be shown and to show hospitality. Growing up in San Diego, California, Mexican culture, Latinx culture swirled around me in vibrant hues and melodic choruses of mariachi songs, amazing food, and deep warmth. Alongside that, being the coastal military town that it is, I was led into so many different ways of being. Where I lived and was schooled, I witnessed variation, which is to say, I witnessed diversity, socioeconomically, culturally, linguistic, physical and cognitive abilities varied, ethnicity, sexual orientation. I was shown and shown early various threads of humanity, many different ways of being. By allowing sleepovers with friends who were Black Muslim or Israeli Jewish, South African Jewish, Chinese American, Korean American, Mexican American, Indigenous American, Puerto Rican, Filipina, my mother, my parents were effectively saying, we believe that their home is safe. We believe that they are safe, and they believe the same about us. I learned some folks eat avocado with scrambled eggs, tortilla, and tapatio or ketchup for breakfast. It's delicious. Some folks eat salmon croquettes with grits that have extra pepper. That's my favorite. We're different, but we're sharing so much by living in community. Nothing about this was perfect. I don't want to paint that picture. It's messy. And growing up like this meant uneasy moments of white friends pausing when the N word was sung in a song and looking at me, first cautiously, then sad, ultimately deciding out loud, it's not okay for me to say that word. It meant that I hoped they would make the same decision when I wasn't there, and also that they understood why. It meant being corrected by my Jewish friend's father as he graciously explained the beauty of the Sabbath to me, and I excitedly responded, I love learning about new religions, to which he said, Judaism is not a new religion. Your Messiah was Jewish. Learn of him. It meant my Chinese American friend generously showing me how her math homework was made easier by using an abacus to count. It meant a boy I was dear friends with in elementary school sharing over a game of tetherball that, like me, he too had a crush on the cutest boy in our class. It also meant encountering steep defensiveness and fragility when harms related to white privilege did occur, because when everyone thinks they are liberal, they often stop or never begin the work of unearthing their privilege and the white supremacy they were born into. Being anti-racist requires work. But this is the work of citizenship, some small parts of it, at least, which maybe are not small at all. And when it is done, honestly, it certainly required vulnerability. I think back, and I think that in my very small corner of the world, I was often seeing an example of what America purports to be: brave. In an article I wrote in 2017, I expressed that privilege, specifically the privilege associated with the construct of whiteness, can disillusion people into thinking that we don't have work to do as citizens of a society. It convinces those who partake in this delusion of whiteness that there is one individualistic, white, right way of being, and everything else is othered, secondary, tertiary. If you are even considered at all, and you are lucky if whiteness is so benevolent as to consider you, call you human and mean it, let alone accommodate you, or even celebrate your identity. Whiteness as a construct of presumed superiority, as a product of colonization, demands that we ignore the massacre of indigenous people, the theft of land, horror of slavery, internment camps, inhumane borders, as if we had a right to close stolen borders to anyone. Whiteness as a construct demands that we ignore the bodies that have been hunted and hung for hundreds of years. In fragility and fear of being obsolete, whiteness as a construct cries out, all lives matter. I need to highlight this because we are experiencing several national crises right now, and all of them are colored by racism. We have to be able to name truthfully the criminal violence being inflicted on Black bodies without being so impoverished that we cannot say their lives matter. Black lives matter, period. To be unable to highlight the bodies being slaughtered contributes to the erasure of Black experiences and the active harm that is happening right now and has happened since the beginning of time in this nation. How unfortunate to say we love something and be unable to see the truth about it and to name it. Sometimes I think one of the most unfortunate things is that for many, being American means being unable to hold the true narrative of the country that one claims to love. Yet we are a nation that doesn't have the luxury of telling anything other than the truth. And still we are a nation that attempts to whitewash its history again and again and again. And this is possibly one of the greatest horrors of all, that in order for the delusion of white supremacy and the construct of whiteness to thrive, you have to misremember, to unknow, to disengage, to live a lie of such grand proportions that it is literally murderous, and to pretend that you cannot see the people who are dying because of it. To uphold the construct of whiteness is to participate in relational violence. Another definition. Relational violence is prioritizing one's own comfort over the humanity of others, diminishing, gaslighting the lived experiences and identities of others in an attempt to bolster oneself while making others feel less than. It can go so far as to cancel or throw away people who dare to call out or call in those who are doing harm. It is a term I use to describe the active violence of apathy. Where I live now, the stretch of houses around me are inhabited by some incredible human beings. Oh, I'm lucky. Most of them are white, and my immediate neighbor, whom I love, took it upon herself to grow a garden this year. And for months prior to planting anything, she tilled the ground. I mean, deep unearthing. I watched her, inspired. There's a lot of rubble, there are rocks. We've had rodents back there. It's nature. But she knew that nothing would grow on a foundation like that. Nothing generative. Nothing that would be nourishing to either of us. She is kind to share. The garden is a beautiful metaphor for so much, right? I believe what is required of each of us is that same work of unearthing, decolonizing within us. But it looks different for everyone. The thing is this: Black people in North America have been fighting for their liberation since the first slave ships arrived here 400 years ago. And that struggle lives in my DNA, in the DNA of Black people. Many white people have lived an entire lifetime and generations before them, never choosing to care deeply about the suffering of marginalized people. Many white people quickly grow tired of conversations about race that make them uncomfortable. Black people have been living this for generations. Stamina. Stamina is needed because it is the work of white people to dismantle the construct of whiteness. I'm going to take a sip of water. We can never say that America is made up of broken systems. America is made up of systems that were designed to use, abuse, suppress, cage, and kill Indigenous bodies, Black bodies, bodies of color. And that is what those systems continue to do. The rubble underneath us has made it impossible to build anything truly generative for far too long. My friend Tori recently, she said, we need a recalibrating of the heart right now. Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. And a professor of mine in lecture this week said, my theological professor said, highlighted that during the occupation of some totalitarian regimes in countries throughout history, the first people often placed in exiles were the writers, the poets, the artists. I share that to illustrate the power of creativity and bold thinking of imagination. It is our superpower, and it is a threat to those who benefit from oppressive systems. Currently, we as a nation are actually debating the validity of a global health crisis and refuse on a national scale to make the health of each citizen, all of our neighbors, a true priority. America has placed economy over humanity since its inception. So while this kind of thinking is born from the depths of scarcity and inhumanity, some will not be able to recognize it as a symptom of the same construct that told bruised and broken bodies to keep picking cotton and drink lemonade on the shore of a beach as people died, back then just as we are now. We have to reimagine. Now. But we have to know who we are and from where we come. If we cannot reimagine policing in 2020, there's something deeply wrong here. The position of a police officer today draws a direct line from that of a slave overseer. And we are surprised at the number of Black people being killed because it's on camera? Surprised by the lack of consequences for these deaths this country, each state, has killed with impunity since its inception. And it is not because Black and brown people are more biologically, inherently violent that they fill America's prisons. It is affected by the fact that every law, every redlining, zoning ordinance to keep us out of communities and in housing projects, every unjust sentencing for nonviolent crimes, every stop and frisk, every cash bail set, every discriminatory hiring practice, no, they were not all halted by affirmative action. Every voter suppression tactic to silence voices, every move this country has made has been to keep these bodies encaged. All of our progress, every piece of progress gained was fought for and paid for with blood. Countless lynchings, shootings, beatings, explosions, house raids after unlawful surveillance, and on and on. And the blood of white people has been shed too, true allies committed to dismantling systems of white supremacy, marching alongside on the quest for liberation. And still this nation fights to uphold statues of Confederate figures who built their wealth with the unpaid labor of stolen human beings. What does that say about us? We cannot call ourselves great when people had to die fighting for the most basic human rights, and they're still dying now. We need to name that. All of it. The only possibility for inward and outward healing depends on it. We are going to be as sick as our secrets and our defensive shame until this work is done. And white people aren't going to get out of this work by proclaiming colorblindness as liberalism. Not seeing color is not a thing. Please, please, please stop. I don't know so much anymore. I'll be honest. I don't know anymore what the words conservative and liberal mean. I used to understand, I think, the political distinctions between ideologies in this country. And I have had throughout my voting history a lot of curiosity about policies and practices upheld by various ideologies. What it sometimes feels like now, though, is that being conservative is attributed to being conservative with your care for human beings, which is seen as being strong, versus being liberal with your care for human beings, which is seen as being weak. Whatever political ideology we align with, we need to agree across the board that we as a collective will operate from a place of abundance as it relates to care for human beings. Systems of bigotry and oppression capitalize on fear, but they also capitalize on ignorance, y'all. And they depend on us staying so isolated from one another that dehumanization becomes so easy, conversations become impossible. We need to seek and fight for broad, spacious ideas of community while we are stewards of this land together. Not just racially broad ideas. It's intersectional. It's broader than binaries. Queer lives, gender non-identifying lives, trans lives and identities all need to be upheld, need to be safe, need to be celebrated. We must unlearn a whitewashed history of erasure. Learn profound and difficult truth, relearn it again and again and again. And unearth the roots of harmful white supremacy within ourselves that tell us to utilize our emotional space to elevate the construct of heterosexual, patriarchal whiteness as the right way of being, while diminishing every other identity. This is our work for relational healing. If our desire is to plant something nourishing in a spacious place within and around us. Right now, there are so many anti-racist resource lists online. An internet search can be so fruitful, we need to make sure we're doing our homework. I'll be transparent. Moving from Southern California to Tennessee was a steep cultural learning curve for me. And I mean steep. Sometimes I've missed a mark that I didn't even know was there. And that has done harm to me and to others. It doesn't matter that it wasn't my intention to do harm. I keep showing up, reading, listening, doing the work to understand the geographical chasms and to unpack my privilege based on where I'm from, where I grew up. It's made me realize, keeping in mind that varying levels of cognitive ability might not make this possible for all of us, many of us will never lose the capacity to keep learning as we age. The sciences support the idea that we'll be happier and live longer if we do. We are the only ones to stand in our own way. It's gonna be messy, but we will never grow past our willingness to be uncomfortable. That's what it means to grow. We will need to admit when we aren't certain. We will need to listen and listen deeply, to care deeply and to keep trying. Let's give it a shot. We are global citizens too. Our citizenship does not end at these borders in terms of our social contract to one another. I think that Mother Teresa had it right when she said, if ever we are lacking in peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to one another. And we do a lot of our belonging here in America. Oh, America. What an idea. We are a young country, but wow, it is an idea that has been a light in this world for a long time. But it is only a dream for some. It is a nightmare for many. And as there are indigenous inhabitants among us, immigrants among us, the descendants of enslaved people among us, refugees among us, we are all citizens. We can either uphold systems that were born out of impoverished, inhumane ideas and practices that require physical and relational violence in order to be upheld, that cause suffering and oppression at every turn, or we can reimagine citizenship. Now listen. Black people and people of color may choose a place under the sun that is as far away from the construct of whiteness as they can find. Hallelujah. That's perfect and understandable because it is hard. Some days feel nearly impossible to breathe here. Racism is suffocating and deeply traumatizing again and again. I care deeply that the energy of marginalized folks, our minds, breath, spirits are protected. I also care deeply that this nation stops wounding us physically, mentally, spiritually, and relationally, fatally. There are debts owed, ones that seem more insurmountable the longer we take to acknowledge them. There has been life and land stolen that cannot be replaced. Reparation is defined as the making of amends for a wrong one has done, by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. I support monetary reparations for the descendants of enslaved people, period. But I also believe that without this internal work, without this acknowledgement of relational violence and dismantling of the construct of whiteness, meaningful amends cannot ever be made. This is our lineage, yes, but it's also our lives. And this is our home. You are a citizen here. A neighbor. You are human. What an amazing, often scary and beautiful thing to be, especially right now. I think some of you are in college, undergrad. I know it's a strange time to be a student, But undergrads, oh, you give me hope for the future. I know you hear that a lot from older people. We mean it. Let us love on you. To everyone listening, imaginations, creativity, capacity for growth can change this world. Those that desire to keep the status quo will aim to villainize you. Remember, you are on the side of true freedom and true bravery. Should you choose to engage in this work, know that I'm wholeheartedly right alongside you, doing my part of it too, doing what we can to fight for some semblance towards justice in the cases of Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and so many others. Fighting to shine a light on the disproportionate violence being inflicted on Black women and Black trans women. Fighting to better care for our planet, this wide world of which we are stewards. Vote, 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 vote locally and nationally. Keep mobilizing. Listen to and take seriously the CDC and World Health Organization guidelines for this pandemic. Take good care. I thank you for practicing deep listening, and I thank you sincerely for the gift of your time. Please go boldly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for your presentation. It was really beautiful and profound. We're really grateful to have you. So we will now begin the Q&A session. This is a reminder to our viewers, you can comment any questions that you may have in the chat box next to this live video. And depending on time, we may not get to all questions. So our first question is as follows. A listener wrote, historian Terence Keel at UCLA makes compelling assertions about the roots of racial thinking in the West as rooted in Christian thinking. Might you have any comments about this?
In the West of, United States, not in the West Coast. I'm assuming in the West, like our
Yes.
West. Okay. Rooted in Christian thinking? Yes, 1,000 times. I'm a theological student. And so much of what I am uncovering is that they're inextricably tied. A lot of the versions, I would say most all of the versions of sacred Christian texts that are read in this nation were translated predominantly by rooms full of white heterosexual men. The Bible was used to uphold slavery not because people were necessarily translating it wrong. It's because in antiquity, people had slaves, and we failed to reimagine something broader, I would argue, largely because of the construct of white supremacy and hatred. And I do think that Christianity has done so much deep harm and continued harm against, I would say, there are a lot of churches that are doing some forward thinking now, but I have to be honest and say there's been a lot of racial harm perpetuated by Christianity. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Our next question is, I strongly agree with what you said about the power of imagination, writers, artists. Do you have in mind any contemporary African-American writers and or artists who might challenge white minds and perhaps provide some nutrition for the deconstruction of whiteness?
Oh, that is so good. That's like hard because there's so many. Gosh, I would say contemporary. I've been reading. I've been going back to Adichie Chimamanda. I feel as though I never pronounce her name correctly, and I apologize wholeheartedly. Rereading Citizen by Claudia Rankine, but also I've been rereading Nikki Giovanni poems that are not necessarily new. I've been going back to interviews. There are some great resource lists that are being put together right now, but I would say that following in real time some of the voices that might challenge your thinking. Cargill, Elizabeth Cargill, Rachel Elizabeth Cargill. I would say, who else is good to follow? These, if you go to my Instagram page and look at who I follow, it's mostly Black women that challenge me, so I know they'll challenge anyone else. But yeah, Alice Walker. I've been reading a lot of Toni Morrison. I've been reading Maya Angelou, and I've just been maybe in this place of wanting to revisit some of those. But there's also just so many revolutionary poets right now and contemporary writers that are doing it. So an anti-racist search on the internet will bring up like in real time what's happening, and my mind is flooded with so many of these amazing stories. But yeah, everything I've encountered I would recommend. So that's maybe something that might take me a little more time to think through, and I can message that person too if they feel comfortable sharing their information. I'd be happy to.
Amazing, thank you. Our next question is, what do you and your contemporaries think that the future of the 4th of July celebration will be, and or the 4th of July in general?
I'm going to be honest and share that I haven't celebrated the 4th of July since 2017. Yeah. So I have been actively celebrating Juneteenth, which is the date that acknowledges the freedom of all people, the actual ending of slavery, theoretically. So I think that 4th of July celebrations are going to be possibly controversial. They're going to make people think a little bit, as they should, as we expand our definitions of citizenship and we really start to hold some of the truths about our history. I think it's natural to look at people who are still celebrating a date where only a portion of the citizens of this nation were free and kind of think that they're saying something, that it doesn't matter to them that Black people were not freed for almost 100 years after that date. I think it's going to be very telling going forward. And I think that as I talk to friends and writers and thinkers, everybody's kind of in that same boat. So I think businesses will kind of need to take a stance. Places will need to figure out how they want to align. Because if we say that we're a free nation and we celebrate a date of freedom where only white people were free, that's a problem. That's a huge problem.
That makes a lot of sense. Our next question is there space for white hurt/guilt? And if so, where?
Oh man, you did. That's so hard. My Lord, my soul. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. But the answer is yes, but it cannot be the expectation of white people, even white people that are in relationship with Black folks and marginalized folks, it cannot be the expectation for marginalized people to hold space for that guilt. It will possibly happen. There will be close relationships, and I've had conversations with white friends that I have known my entire life and have been walking alongside them as they're doing their work of dismantling, and they are so considerate of the space that they occupy, where I have been able to practice empathy and recognize some of what really probably eats them up in terms of guilt about their whiteness. But at the same time, our emotional energy we've been expected to use our emotional energy to comfort white people, to catch white tears. Slaves that were beat were then expected to console their master for feeling guilty. And there just is no space for that kind of harm if our true aim is healing. So that work needs to be done internally. And I think there will also be space in progressive communities of white folks who are doing the same work. And my advice would be to start there. Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question is, how can we convince those comfortable in their whiteness to do this work that makes them uncomfortable?
I think that something that I've had I don't want to say success, but that I've been able to point out to people in such a way that has maybe caused them to think, is that Black folks, marginalized folks, have never had the option of comfort. That is like such an illusion to so many people. So the idea of somebody saying that they don't want to feel comfortable talking about or acknowledging harm when people have been from a young age. I did a podcast recently where one of the hosts asked me, do you ever remember a time of not being aware that there was racism? And I said, no, but I also said Black parents have to ready their children for the world to keep our bodies safe. So I challenge a white person's discomfort up against a 5-year-old Black girl being told how she needs to hold herself in the street so that nobody thinks she's not from a good home or doesn't have home training, or so the police don't stop her. Or it's just, that's too egregious. It's outrageous to imagine. And there's such an complete and total unawareness of the depth of privilege if someone even thinks that their discomfort can measure up against living actual racism each day. So I would say offer that as a challenge, offer that gently, but also firmly. I don't believe that love needs to coddle. I was raised by people who, my mother and father, celebrated me and loved us, and also could like tell us about ourselves and tell us we needed to work harder and tell us. And so I think love needs to be truthful. And so that would be my offering, is to approach it that way, with gentleness, but also with bold truth.
That's really great advice. I wanted to ask, are reparations optional at the individual level? And what should they look like?
These are good questions. Okay. I think that, okay, I'm going to quote Miss Trudy. I'm going to quote a white woman in her 70s from Mississippi. So this is not even coming from. She has said to me that she believes reparations to be deeply necessary for the healing of white people. Like that truly, if there's not some form of acknowledgement that there is a debt, and then the positioning of repayment of that debt, that there's a healing that's not going to happen within white people. This is a white woman that grew up in the Jim Crow South. So I echo that. I think that it can look so many ways. I have dear friends. I want to name them. I'm thinking of them, but I don't know if they want to be named. Dear white friends who I think with their lives on a daily basis pay a form of reparation to the Black community, whether it be through the work that they do, or showing up with their bodies in safe ways that they can in forms of protest, silently bailing a protester out of jail, paying the rent of a Black mother one month when they were able to. Like, it doesn't have to be always a monetary. There are so many ways to engage. I do believe this government as a whole needs to find a way to truly pay reparations to the descendants of enslaved people. I am a proponent of that. But I think on an individual level, there are ways of engaging in acknowledging our shared kind of stewardship of this space, but also the fact that some have more than others because of systems of privilege, and finding ways to repay that, whether it be offering a service to someone because you have an expertise that they don't have, or just showing up humbly and listening. I think you'll find those moments. I really do believe that.
Our next question is, do you think there could be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in our country? What could that look like? Would this be helpful for both white people and people of color?
Oh, that's good. I do think that it is a possibility. I I think the amount of work that has to be done, and I guess why I'm taking time to think through my answers, because it could be something where the work doesn't have to be done prior. The work is, the unearthing is happening like as people are gathering around to kind of build something new. That is an option as well. And so maybe that's what it looks like, is that while we are trying to teach true, accurate versions of history to people, as we are trying to dismantle systems, we are also meeting alongside one another to figure out reconciliation. Those two things could be happening simultaneously. And I think that we need to be on a communal level having these conversations. And I know that none of this can happen in person right now in the times that we're living in. But I envision sort of town hall reconciliation conversations. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done in breaking down white fragility, because the space doesn't need to be people of color in the same room as white people who are just coming to an awareness of privilege and working through the harms of white liberalism and taking up a lot of space and all the oxygen and every sort of step that can come after that. That needs to happen prior. Because the work does not need to inflict more harm on marginalized folks.
Yes. In some of your written work, you talk about the resistance of marginalized folks as magic. How can that magic be cultivated and kept alive?
Shamana, that's good. I love that. I'm glowing right now because I'm holding the magic in my spirit of the women on my wall that you cannot see, my mother and aunts. I'm holding the magic of Black women in Los Angeles, 2,000 miles away, of ancestors, people that are here in my community, divinity community of theological studies here in Nashville. So I think that there's an alchemy about it. I think we can hold one another's stories really carefully with a lot of love and respect and reverence. I think there's something about the themes and the through lines and the poems and the dancing of words. And I'm picturing one of my line sisters right now, interpretive dancing. I'm holding that magic with me. So there's just, there's these ways that we can see one another very intentionally and very much the opposite of the way that the world has always seen us. And by doing so, that is an act of resistance. But also by doing so, there's something that's cultivated within each of us that says, keep going. That says, it doesn't matter what they say, you've got this. And that can remind you that you're golden and that you're shining. And so I think sharing with one another, being safe spaces for each other, holding on to the sacredness, the divinity within each of us, I think that's how we cultivate and keep that magic.
Thank you. That's so beautiful. Should non-Black people of color's activism around Black Lives Matter look different from white folks' activism?
Oh, that is great. Y'all are good. I think it's felt different for me during this time as I'm thinking of specifically Latina friends and Asian American friends that have sent messages during this time or sent videos from protests that they're going to, and I guess maybe why I say that it should look different or that it feels different is maybe what I want to commit to, is that those friends have been walking alongside me the entire time, whereas there are white friends who kind of have come to this conversation at different spaces in life and down the line, or still maybe don't really acknowledge things but out loud, but there's this sort of felt my friends of color growing up where I grew up and growing up around so many friends of color experienced discrimination alongside me. So we were allying, I want to say, alongside one another at an early age, like learning, okay, why is that? Okay, that's inappropriate for that person to say. And like, if this person says this, I'm gonna have Diana's back, or I'm gonna, you know, just sort of figuring out how to care for one another. So while their experience is not the same and they're not Black, I do think that their ally work brings their ancestors, brings the Indigenous, brings so much that comes from oppression, that it has to be, or that it, I want to say it's like it holds a different space. And all of my friends who are people of color have not at any point in time during this time been trying to steal the mic or say, and also us. They've been yelling Black Lives Matter. But I think that their work will look different than white folks because they're coming from histories and lineages of oppression for the most part. So.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Does being in a close relationship with a person of color give you increased access to their experiences around race?
Yeah, I think so. I have had conversations, but also experiences living in LA, with friends like Anna, with friends who were present in such a beautiful and felt authentic way, I'm with you kind of way. But also have, because they are white, have been just witnesses to certain things that I've experienced. And so they could be supports and have been, and that is beautiful. But I also think that if they hadn't been, walking alongside a Black person who was their friend, would they have experienced that the same way? And would it have affected them the same way? I think we can be, I want to say that for me, in my attempts to be an ally to my queer friends, to my trans friends, I always want to be I'm always a grateful visitor in those spaces. But I also think that by the gift of them letting me into their lives and their experiences, I am gaining a broader picture of a community that is not just painted through books that I've read and documentaries that I've seen, but also through the actual daily living. There's something really special about the personal connections too. So I think, yeah.
Thank you. And our last question for tonight is, how can gratitude be part of our activism?
What? I wish I knew who said that. That is, I'm sorry. That is good. It is. I mean, I'm going to tell you that I try to wake up every morning with a word or a phrase or a meditation of gratitude during this time. Even now, especially now, both of those, even now and especially now. Gratitude is resistance. To say I'm still going to acknowledge that there are things to be grateful for, I'm still going to hold joy in whatever ways there are, is to say that the system has not taken everything from me. And that is not to diminish the days where people get up and just are getting through. Because I don't want to paint a picture that people need to be feeling okay when things are very clearly not okay and when folks are very clearly not okay. But I do think that there are my neighbor's growing vegetables in the back, the garden, but also sunflowers in the front. And just opening my door to have the screen, the storm door, and be able to see outside sunflowers and flowers and butterflies. It's free. Like sometimes I sit there and I'm like, I get to look at this for free. It's so beautiful. A friend sent me a video to, I believe, watch live jellyfish at an aquarium in Monterey, California, which just is relaxing and beautiful. I practice gratitude when I do that. When I hear from family, there's so many, we don't know, how much time we have, and we don't know what's next. And so I think that if we can each day find something of gratitude, that is strong resistance. against systems of oppression, and also just building your internal, I think, fortitude for the practice of joy. And that's really powerful too. These are great questions.
Thank you so much. That question concludes tonight's event. I just want to thank you again, Courtney, for your presentation and your thoughtful answers during the Q&A. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in to tonight's event and asking really great questions.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.